Hey there guys, this is Cole. Welcome back to another video game review. This is probably the last video game review or video I'm just gonna do today in general. In case I decide to do a live stream tonight, but I'm not sure yet. We shall see. But recently I reviewed the original Dead Space game, which came out in 2008 for the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. So I figured I might as well review the Dead Space remake. And I know what you guys are thinking. Well, why are you skipping ahead to the Dead Space remake? Well, because I feel like it. And number two, I'm actually, now, it's going to take me some time because the Xbox is at my dad's house and I only go there like once every 1 to 2 weeks. But I'm going to replay Dead Space 2 and eventually have a review out, but that'll be a while. And then I'll review Dead Space 3, and then we'll do a ranking video with the Dead Space games after that. But, the Dead Space remake. Now, I do own this game, but I don't have it with me at the moment because one of my friends borrowed this game so they can play it. But, I'm going to review the game. So, what is the plot to the Dead Space remake? Well, the plot of this game is as follows. Engineer Isaac Clarke goes on a repair mission on the USG Ishimura, only to come across a nightmarish bloodbath. The ship's crew has been horribly slaughtered and infected by an alien scourge with creatures known as necromorphs. Now Isaac is cut off and engage in a desperate fight for survival. So that's basically the plot of his game. So again, it does follow pretty much the plot of the original game because this is a remake after all. And anyways, how was this game received? Well, how was this game received? Well, how did development begin on this? Well, the Dead Space remake was announced in 2021, and when the game was released on January 27th of 2023, the Dead Space remake, when it was released on January 27th, 2023, for the PlayStation 5, the Xbox Series X/S, as well as PC, the game received phenomenal reviews from critics and audiences, and the Dead Space remake is considered one of the best survival horror games ever made. Now, as for my reaction to the game, this is really the game that got me into Dead Space because, like I said in my review of the original Dead Space game, before the Dead Space remake came out, I had only played a little bit of Dead Space 3, didn't really get into it, and then in 2023, when I bought the PlayStation 5, I played the Dead Space remake, and I absolutely loved that game. In fact, I beat that game twice. It was that good of a game. And then in 2023, I played Dead Space 2 on the Xbox One with a copy. In fact, in 2023, right after I played the Dead Space remake on the PS5, I played Dead Space 2, which I own a copy of that for Xbox 360, and I absolutely love Dead Space 2. I think it's the best game in the series, but this remake I thought was really good. So, without further ado, let's get into the review. So, the game starts off where we are introduced to our main character, Isaac Clarke, who is voiced by Gunnar Wright, one thing I will say I do like about this remake that I thought was a vast improvement over the original. Now, do not get me wrong, the original game is good, but even though I thought that the original game was good, my main issue with it was the fact that Isaac Clarke was a completely silent character throughout the original game. Like, when people would interact with him, he wouldn't respond, which that kind of did throw me off. Now, if it were a first-person shooter game, I could understand, but Dead Space is not a first-person shooter, so that did kind of throw me off about the original, but I like how in this game they gave Isaac Clarke a voice. That's one thing that this does better than the original game. I think it really develops his character and, gives a little more personality to his character. And like I said, the game starts off where there's a voice message recording hologram of Dr. Nicole Brennan, who is Isaac Clarke's girlfriend, who does play a major part of the game. But she says, "Oh, I've missed you so much. I wish I missed you so much. I am so sorry. I'm sorry about everything." And then we are introduced to a girl by the name of Kendra, who is talking to Isaac saying, "You must miss her so much. You keep playing that message over and over again." and then we're introduced to Hammond, to Captain Hammond, who is like Dr. Hammond, who is the captain of the ship. Which, granted, it is a big ship, but it is tiny in comparison to the one they're gonna go on, where we're introduced to the captain of the ship, Hammond, and of course Chen, a character by the name of Chen, who is basically, you know, on the ship with Isaac Clarke and his crew, and they basically have to go to a really large ship called the USG Ishimura. And the reason they have to go to this ship is they have to go basically on a repair mission. That's the main objective. And as you can guess, you know, at first it seems like everything's going fine, but as soon as Isaac Clarke you know, turns on the system, he says the engines are all fine and stuff like that. And then, you know, Isaac says that the hull on the ship has been damaged and is really big damage. And then Chen asks his crew what could do that type of damage to a planet cracker and stuff like that. And then of course there is the whole very intense scene where it says quarantine activated, where, you know, the siren goes on and the light is covered in the lead, and the room is covered in a red siren sort of like thing, when Isaac Clarke is on the other side of the glass, and then Hammond's like, wait a minute, do you hear that? And then of course there's the whole scene where Chen is shooting his pulse rifle as he hears something in the vents, and then a necromorph, which is like this alien mutated, which is this mutated human corpse with an alien disease, goes behind basically goes behind Chen and stabs him in the back with these giant spikes coming out of its arm. And then Kendra's saying, Isaac, go, run. And then not long after that, you play as Isaac Clarke. And then, of course, you basically have to run away from the necromorphs. And then, of course, there's the whole scene where you play as Isaac Clarke. And once you're done running away from the necromorphs, you close the door. You know, that way you can go down the elevator. But before that happens, the necromorph manages to open up the elevator, and then it's about to attack you, but the necromorph dies because the elevator closes on it, you know, crushing it with blood spraying on Isaac's face. And Isaac's like, Jesus, like, that right there is a very intense way to open up your game. Very intense. And then not long after that, you know, once you're playing as Isaac Clarke on the USG Ishimura, you go down the elevator and you hear this guy, you know, screaming in pain like, oh God, help me. And then not long after that, when you're playing as Isaac Clarke, you basically come across a table with blood written on the wall that says cut off their limbs. And then you come across this gun by the name, you come across a gun called the Plasma Cutter, which basically is a gun where what makes Dead Space unique and different from other survival horror games, I mean, with Resident Evil, it's like you just gotta shoot at the enemies, you know, go for the head, but this goes for a very different approach where, yes, you can still shoot at enemies' heads, but the best way to get rid of your enemies in this game, basically, this is a game that requires melee combat, basically meaning you have to brutally dismember your enemies by hacking off their limbs with the plasma rifle. In a way, basically that way you can conserve a lot of ammo, and that I think is very interesting. I think that's a very different approach to a type of horror game. And again, I think that the melee combat in this game is really good. And then of course, you know, throughout the course of the game, you're experiencing this more intense survival horror atmosphere, and this is a really good psychological horror game too. Like, there's a thing in this game called the marker, which I'm not going to spoil what it does because that might ruin a twist of the game in case those are interested to play it, but the marker, it's interesting. I'll just leave it at that. And this game does have a very good plot twist. I will definitely say that. And then of course there's the whole scene where you're playing as Isaac Clarke, and you basically go inside a room, and you basically have to get something in food supply. And then not long after that, the bad guy of the game, the main bad guy of the game, Dr. Mercer, is planning on releasing these necromorphs on Earth, and he basically freezes you with a stasis gun, with a stasis pack, which just freezes your character in place. And he's talking to Isaac Clarke, and then he says, dismemberment, I think you're on the right track. and then he basically leaves the room, and then there's this really intense type of creature, really intense, different type of necromorph called the Hunter. And what makes the Hunter very intense is that, unlike other necromorphs, this one can actually regenerate its limbs if you hack them off, which makes it very intense. And then you're playing as Isaac Clarke, and then, it comes into play, later on in the game when you're playing as Isaac Clarke and you're trying to stop Dr. Mercer. You basically have to fight the Hunter, but the way you have to defeat the Hunter, you have to wait until there's basically, I don't know how to describe it. There's basically like this large chamber with 4 doors opened up, where basically how you have to do this, this creature will walk inside the chamber, and then you have to freeze it with a stasis pack really fast, and then you gotta run, open up the door, and then push the activate button on the sensory pad, which basically controls the doors to the chamber, and then basically freezes up the creature. Which, that right there, like, I'll be honest, the first time I played this game, I did not know that, and it took me a while to figure that out, but overall, yeah. And continuing on with the game, throughout the course of it, I think that this is a really intense game. I especially like how this game, it took the best. And what I really like about this Dead Space remake game, it took the best elements of the original Dead Space as well as Dead Space 2, and it perfectly molded them together to give us a really phenomenal game. And there's also other good weapons in this game too, like for instance, the pulse rifle. That's probably my favorite weapon, but you also have the flamethrower, which I think is a really good weapon too in this game. And again, with zero spoilers whatsoever, the whole plot twist about the whole plot twist revealed at the end of this game, like, is a really good plot twist. I thought that was rather well done. And this game was developed, and the thing that sucks about this, now, do not get me wrong, this is a great game, and now, when the original Dead Space game came out, the original Dead Space, it got great reviews and it sold really well. Now, the Dead Space remake is pretty much the same thing. The Dead Space remake, the game did, when this game came out, it did receive phenomenal reviews from critics and audiences. In fact, many people would tell you this is the best Dead Space game we've ever had. In fact, the game got phenomenal reviews from critics and audiences, with people saying that this game was even better than the original game, which I would say that. Again, no disrespect to the original game. I think the original game is good. I just think this remake is better, and I tend to agree with that general consensus. But, of course, EA was a bunch of idiots, and EA was hoping that the Dead Space remake would sell just as well as Resident Evil, and now granted, the game, it did do decent in sales. I mean, EA standard makes no sense, because EA, they were expecting this game to, like, they said they wanted this game to sell at least 2 million copies. However, this game sold about 4.5 million copies, but just because it didn't sell triple of what they wanted, they consider that a failure. Like, that is so stupid. That honestly does not make any sense, because this game was great. In fact, many people loved this game. In fact, the Dead Space remake got phenomenal reviews from critics and audiences, with a bunch of people saying it was the best Dead Space game since Dead Space 2, which I would agree with. Now, in terms of small little nitpicks, and these are only very minor, now, I will say, I do think that the final boss fight in this game, I will say, it is a little better than the original. It is better than the boss fight in the original game, the Hive Mind. It is better designed here, and it is overall better, but I'm still not the biggest fan of the boss fight. I kind of think the final boss fight sucks in this game. And the final nitpick I will have, and this is an issue I had in the original, I'm not the biggest fan of the comms array key puzzle, but other than the exception of those 2 little minor nitpicks, the Dead Space remake is a phenomenal horror game. It is the second best, and this is the best Dead Space game we have had since Dead Space 2, and I'm going to give the Dead Space remake a 9 out of 10. So yeah. Anyways, guys, that was my review of the Dead Space remake, and we will catch you guys later. Bye-bye now.